Dust. Always the dust first. It rolled off the cattle pens in slow brown waves, catching the July sun, until the whole yard looked like it was burning, from the inside. 4 women stood on the auction platform, hands locked together, so tight the knuckles had gone bone white. Sisters. You could see it in the shape of their jaws, the same stubborn set to the chin. "Sell the fat one first," a man near the rail called out, grinning through a mouth missing half its teeth. "Men pay more when she looks scared." Laughter. The ugly kind, spreading through the crowd like sickness. The eldest stood at the front, chin lifted high, because pain was easier to manage than fear. Blue eyes swept the crowd, not pleading, but counting. At the edge of the yard, a man in a dark coat sat a horse too well groomed for cattle country. He wasn't watching the women. He was watching the road. Waiting for someone. The auctioneer raised his gavel hand. And then a voice cut through the yard like a rifle shot. "Dust first. Always the dust first." It rolled off the cattle pens in slow brown waves, catching the July sun, until the whole yard looked like it was burning, from the inside. Silverbend, Montana Territory. A town too small for a real courthouse, and too proud to admit it. A town that smelled like manure, and whiskey, and something worse. Something nobody wanted to name. Because today the yard wasn't selling cattle. "Sell the fat one first," a man near the rail called out, grinning through a mouth missing half its teeth. "Men pay more when she looks scared." Laughter. Ugly laughter. The kind that spreads, through a crowd like sickness, one man catching it, from the next, until the whole yard was infected. 4 women stood on the auction platform. Hands locked together, so tight the knuckles had gone bone white. Sisters. You could see it in the shape of their jaws, the same stubborn set to the chin, passed down like an heirloom nobody asked for. Eleanor Ashford stood at the front. 26 years old. Auburn hair pinned back hard enough to hurt, because pain was easier to manage than fear. Blue eyes. Broad shoulders. A body built for work, not for looking pretty in some parlor, and the crowd had already decided, that made her less. Made her cheap. Behind her, Margaret. Everyone called her Maggie. 24. Brown hair, sharp eyes, the kind of stillness that comes from watching too much, and saying too little. She wasn't shaking. Not yet. She was counting. Counting men, counting rifles, counting exits that didn't exist. Charlotte stood next. 21. Soft-faced, blonde, and trembling so hard her teeth clicked. She was the gentle one. The one who used to hum, while she worked, back when there was still something worth humming about. And at the very back, half hidden behind her sisters like she could fold herself out of existence. Adeline. 19. Dark hair stuck to her damp cheeks. She stared at her own boots, because the boots didn't judge her. The crowd did. Men had ridden in, from 3 counties for this. Word traveled fast in cattle country, faster than shame ever did, and by sunup half of Silverbend had crowded the rails to watch. Ranchers. Loggers. A pair of saloon girls perched on an overturned crate, giggling behind gloved hands at a joke nobody bothered to make quietly. Because cruelty performed in public always finds an audience, and an audience always finds a way to make itself feel innocent for watching. The auctioneer climbed the platform steps like a man mounting a stage he was proud of. Which told you everything you needed to know about him. Because a decent man wouldn't have felt pride here. Not with 4 sisters lined up like prize heifers. Not with the smell of the pen still thick in the air, manure and sweat, and something bitter underneath, that might have been shame, if shame had a scent at all. Hargrove hovered at the edge of the platform, twisting his hat in both hands. He kept glancing toward the road out of town. Not at his nieces. At the road. Like he was waiting on someone, and whoever it was, he badly wanted the money in his pocket, before that someone arrived. Nobody in the crowd noticed. Nobody but Adeline, who noticed everything precisely, because she was too afraid to look directly at anything in front of her. She watched her uncle's eyes instead of the crowd's mouths. And what she saw there wasn't only greed. It was fear. Small. Buried. But there. She filed it away the way she filed away color, and shadow and light, without understanding what it meant yet. Only that it meant something. For healthy females, the auctioneer bellowed, tugging at a vest stained with old sweat. Ages 19 to 26. Strong as oxen. Cook, clean, wash, breed. Father's dead. No family left except their uncle here, who's kindly agreed to see them placed. Kindly. Eleanor's jaw tightened at that word like it was a fist closing around her throat. Because their uncle was standing right there. Jacob Hargrove. A thin man with quick fingers and quicker eyes, the kind that never quite landed on yours. 6 months ago he'd buried his brother, and inherited everything that came with the grave. The land. The stock. Their mother's jewelry, sold off piece by piece, before the funeral flowers had even wilted. And now he was selling the last thing left to sell. $50 for the lot, someone shouted. I'll put them to work in my logging camp. Cooks. Laundresses. 75, another voice answered. Mine work underground. Big girls pull their weight. 80, a third man called, and this one didn't even bother standing. Just raised 2 fingers, from where he leaned against the rail, like the whole transaction bored him already. Eleanor's mind raced faster than she could control it. $80. $80 for 4 human lives, and the number kept climbing, so slow it felt almost gentle, which was the cruelest part of all. Because gentle numbers still ended the same way. Sold. Separated. Gone. She looked at Charlotte's shaking hands. At Adeline's bowed head. At Maggie, still counting, still calculating odds, that never once came out in their favor. And she thought, God help her, that if this was how it ended, she would at least make sure the last thing these men heard from her was not a whimper. More laughter. Someone whistled. Someone made a comment about Charlotte's size low enough that he thought she couldn't hear it. She heard it. She heard all of it. Her whole body flinched like she'd been struck, and Eleanor's grip tightened around her sister's hand, until it hurt them both. Hold on, Eleanor whispered. Don't let go. No matter what happens. I don't want to be separated, Adeline choked the words out, barely a whisper. We'll find each other again, Maggie said. Somehow. Because that was the only prayer left to them. Not rescue. Not mercy. Just somehow. The auctioneer raised his gavel hand. Do I hear 100? And then a voice cut through the yard like a rifle shot. 500, it said. For all 4. Together. The crowd turned as one body. Every head. Every eye. Because a voice like that didn't belong in a place like this, low and rough and final, the kind of voice that had never once needed to raise itself to be obeyed. Garrett Cole stood at the edge of the ring. 6.5 feet of scarred, weathered muscle, built by 20 years of mountain winters, and work most men wouldn't survive. A scar ran from his left eyebrow down to his jaw, pale against sun-darkened skin. His eyes were the color of ice, over deep water, and right now, that ice was aimed at every man in that crowd, one at a time, like he was memorizing faces for later. He stepped forward. Slow. Certain. The kind of walk that didn't need to hurry, because it had never once needed to run from anything. $500. For 4 women every rancher in that yard had already priced as worthless. The yard went quiet in a way that wasn't natural. Even the horses shifted at their posts, ears back, sensing something in the air that hadn't been there a moment before. 500, the auctioneer repeated, and his voice cracked on the second word. Did I hear that right, Mr. Cole? You did. Cash. All 4 sisters. Together. Now. Hargrove nearly threw himself between Garrett and the platform. Because $500 was more money than he'd seen in his whole miserable life, and greed had a way of making a man brave even when every instinct screamed at him to stay quiet. Now hold on, Hargrove said, licking his lips. Why would a man like you pay that much for? He stopped. Looked at the sisters like they were something spoiled on a shelf. For these girls. These girls. Eleanor's spine went rigid. Because that phrase landed like a slap. These girls. Like they were sacks of flour. Like they were culled stock. Like 4 years of starving, and scrubbing, and burying their own father hadn't made them people at all. Garrett didn't look at Hargrove. Didn't give the man the dignity of eye contact. His gaze stayed on the sisters instead, steady, unhurried. Not the look of a buyer sizing up property. Something else. Something closer to a man finally seeing 4 human beings, after a whole yard full of men who'd only seen livestock. You got a problem with my offer, Garrett said. It wasn't a question. Hargrove's eyes flicked between the money and the platform. No problem. I'm just curious what a mountain man wants, with 4, and here he made the mistake of grinning, for fat women. The laughter came again. Charlotte flinched so hard she nearly went down. Adeline squeezed her eyes shut like she could make the whole yard disappear. But Eleanor stepped forward. You don't get to insult us anymore, she said, and her voice didn't shake, not even a little. Your right to speak about us ended the moment you decided to sell your own blood. Hargrove sneered. You weren't much family to begin with. Garrett's voice dropped low enough that the whole yard felt it in their boots. I'll say this once, he said. You speak another word against these women. You won't walk out of this yard. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because everyone in that crowd understood, in the way animals understand a storm, before it arrives, that Garrett Cole did not make idle threats. The auctioneer cleared his throat, hands trembling around the gavel. 500. Any other bids? Silence. Because not one rancher, not one logger, not one saloon keeper in that whole territory was fool enough to bid against a man like that. Sold, the auctioneer said, to Mr. Garrett Cole. The gavel fell. And just like that, 4 sisters who had been priced, mocked, and nearly sold off, into 4 separate kinds of hell were standing together in the settling dust, alive, and free, and completely unsure, if any of it was real. Garrett walked to the platform. Up close he was even bigger, and for one terrible second Eleanor's whole body braced for the thing every man, before this one had wanted from her. Can you climb down? Garrett asked. Or do you need help? No man had asked them anything in months. Not what they needed. Not what they wanted. Just asked, and waited, like the answer actually mattered. Eleanor climbed down alone. Refused his hand, not out of spite, but because some stubborn part of her needed to prove she still could stand on her own 2 feet after everything. Charlotte's boot slipped at the edge of the platform. Garrett caught her, before she hit the ground, steady as a fence post, careful as a man handling something he actually valued. Maggie came down watching him the whole way, cataloguing him the way she catalogued everything. Weighing him. Waiting for the moment the kindness would curdle into something else, the way it always had before. It didn't come. Adeline was last. She stood frozen at the platform's edge, shaking so hard her knees knocked, and Garrett didn't rush her. Didn't grab. He just waited, patient as stone, until she finally reached out her own hand. He took it gently. Guided her down like she was something breakable. Which, in that moment, she was. When all four stood in front of him, Garrett looked at each of them in turn. Slow. Deliberate. "You're coming with me," he said. "You'll be safe on my land. Nobody separates you again." Eleanor studied him, eyes narrowed, arms crossed. Because trust wasn't a gift she handed out anymore. It was a debt men had to earn, one careful inch at a time. "Why?" she said. "Because I won't stand by, while 4 women get sold like cattle." A pause. Something quiet moved behind his eyes, old and heavy. "Because your father would have wanted better for you. And because I've got work needs doing. Honest work. Fair wages." "You mean employment," Maggie said, careful. "I mean a home." Simple words. Except they landed like thunder. Behind them, Hargrove was already shoving the money into his coat, not sparing his nieces a second glance. "Take them," he muttered. "They're your problem now." Garrett turned. For the first time, he looked directly at the man. "You'll regret that sentence," he said quietly. "One day. They were never a problem. They're 4 women you were too small to deserve." Hargrove shrank back like the words had physical weight. Garrett looked at the sisters one last time. "You ready to leave this place behind?" They exchanged a glance. The kind only sisters share, a whole conversation passing between them, without a single word. "Yes," Eleanor said. "We're ready." And Adeline, so quiet all day she'd barely spoken, finally whispered the only thing she had left in her. "Please. Take us home." But before they turned toward the horses, Garrett went still. Just for a second. Just long enough, that Maggie noticed, because noticing things was the only power she had left. His eyes had caught on a rider at the far edge of the yard. A man in a dark coat too fine for cattle country, sitting a horse too well groomed for a working ranch, watching the whole auction, from a distance, with the flat, patient stare of someone counting something other than heads of stock. Garrett's jaw tightened. "You know that man?" Maggie asked, before she could stop herself. Garrett didn't answer right away. Which told her more than any answer would have. "I know who he rides for," he said finally. "And who's that?" "Cornelius Vane." The name meant nothing to Maggie. Not yet. Except something in the way Garrett said it, flat and careful, like a man stepping around a hole he already knew was there, made the hair on her arms rise anyway. "Who's Vane?" she asked. "A man who buys up land nobody wants to sell him," Garrett said. "And usually gets it." He didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. Because the rider in the dark coat had already turned his horse, and ridden off toward town, unhurried, like a man who'd seen exactly what he came to see. Maggie filed the name away. Cornelius Vane. She didn't know yet that it would matter. She only knew, the way she always knew things, before she could prove them, that it would. Horses were saddled beneath a cottonwood at the edge of the yard. 4 of them, plus Garrett's own enormous draft horse, a creature built like a wall with legs. He checked each saddle himself. Each cinch strap. Worked with the kind of quiet, practiced care that didn't need an audience to be genuine. "Eleanor," he said, gesturing to a strong bay mare. "She's steady. Fast. Won't spook." Eleanor nodded, surprised despite herself. Men talked about her before. Talked around her. Never once talked to her like her opinion of a horse actually mattered. Maggie. This roan's calm. Reliable. Suits someone who thinks before she rides. Maggie blinked. She'd said maybe 10 words all day. And yet somehow, impossibly, he already understood her. Charlotte. This paint mare, she'll take care of you. Charlotte pressed her palm to the horse's neck. "Thank you," she whispered, and wasn't entirely sure if she meant the horse or the man. Last, he turned to Adeline, who stood shaking, so hard it looked like her bones might come apart at the seams. He crouched slightly, bringing his towering frame down, until he was near her eye level. "Adeline. You'll ride the gray. She's gentle. Won't bolt even if you're scared." Adeline's voice cracked. "I haven't ridden in a long time." "That's all right," Garrett said. Steady as river stone. "You'll do just fine." She didn't believe him. Not yet. But something in the way he said it made her want to try anyway. And so, 5 riders left Silverbend behind. Left the jeers. Left Hargrove counting his blood money in the dust. Left the auction platform standing empty in the sun, waiting for its next tragedy. But freedom, Eleanor already understood, always came with a price. She just didn't know yet what this one would cost. The land rose fast outside town, foothills climbing into pine forest, the air turning cool and clean with every mile. For women who'd known nothing but hunger and exhaustion for months, hour after hour in the saddle was both agony and something close to healing. Nobody spoke for a long stretch. Just the creak of leather. The clop of hooves on hard-packed trail. The occasional sharp intake of breath, when a sore muscle protested too loud to ignore. Eleanor broke the silence first. Because someone always had to, and it was rarely anyone but her. "Why'd you do it?" she asked, voice carrying back, over her shoulder. $500. For women you'd never met. Garrett guided his horse around a fallen log before answering. "Because you're sisters. Most men wouldn't care. Most men ain't worth caring about." Eleanor pressed further, because she always did, because stopping at the first answer had never once kept her safe. "But why you?" Garrett's jaw tightened. For a long moment there was only the wind, and the horses, and the weight of something he clearly hadn't said out loud in a long time. "Because someone should have saved my wife," he said. "And my daughter." A beat. The whole world seemed to hold still around that sentence. Nobody did. Nobody asked more. Because even from horseback, even from strangers who'd known this man for less than an hour, they could feel the grief in it. Old. Weathered. Still very much alive under the scars. By late afternoon they stopped near a creek. The horses drank greedily, while the sisters dismounted, legs stiff, backs screaming. Charlotte hissed, sinking onto a flat rock. "I believe my bones have turned to dust." Garrett offered his arm. Not grabbing. Just offering. She took it, grateful, and something in her chest loosened just slightly, like a stitch finally coming undone the right way. Adeline stayed frozen in her saddle, unable to swing her leg over. Garrett approached slow, the way a man approaches a spooked animal he genuinely doesn't want to frighten. "I'll help you down," he said. "If you want me to." She nodded, once. He lifted her like she weighed nothing. Set her down gentle. Steadied her when she wobbled, not holding too tight, not letting go too soon. She whispered, confused by the unfamiliar kindness. "Is this how you treat all women?" Garrett shook his head. "No. This is how I treat people, who deserve better than what they've had." Nobody knew how to answer that. So nobody tried. Except Charlotte, a moment later, because silence never sat right with her for long. "Do you always talk this little?" she asked, "or are we a special occasion?" Garrett looked at her sideways. Something flickered near his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough. "Depends," he said. "You always ask this many questions. Only when the answers matter." "Then get comfortable," Garrett said. "Might be a quiet few years." Charlotte laughed. Actual laughter, surprised right out of her chest, the first sound of its kind any of them had made in longer than she could remember. Eleanor turned at the noise like she'd forgotten laughter was still a thing bodies could do. "There it is," Maggie murmured, mostly to herself. "I was starting to wonder if we'd forgotten how." Even Adeline's mouth twitched, just at the corner. Small. Fragile. But real. Garrett didn't laugh. Men like him rarely did, out loud, where it could be seen. But something eased in his shoulders, that hadn't been eased a moment before, and Eleanor noticed it the way she noticed everything about horses, and men who thought they were hiding something. Filed it away. Said nothing. Because a man, who hadn't laughed in 20 years still remembered exactly how it sounded, when someone else did. He built the fire himself. Beans and salt pork. Hardtack softened in broth. Strong, dark tea that none of them had tasted in longer than they could remember. When he served the plates, he gave the largest portions to the sisters, without a second thought. "Eat," he said. "Your bodies are starving." Eleanor stiffened out of old habit. "We're not invalids." "No," Garrett agreed. "You're strong women who've been fed like prisoners. That ends today." Maggie studied him across the fire. Tried to fit the pieces together the way she fit numbers, into a ledger, looking for the place where the sums didn't balance. Because he was intimidating beyond reason. Scarred. Enormous. Quiet in a way that suggested violence lived somewhere deep in him, banked like coals. And yet he handled their food, their horses, their fear, with a gentleness she couldn't reconcile with the size of his hands. "Is it true you live alone?" she asked. 20 years, Garrett said, turning the meat. "Big ranch. Too big. Needs hands. Needs voices. Needs life in it." Adeline's voice found the firelight for the first time all day. "Were you lonely?" Garrett didn't answer with words. The silence answered for him. That night, wrapped in blankets Garrett had provided, the sisters slept, without fear of a door slamming open. Without a man's voice demanding something in the dark. For the first time in longer than any of them could count, sleep came easy. Garrett kept watch alone. Rifle across his knees. A massive silhouette carved out of firelight, and old grief. Eleanor watched him, through half-closed eyes, before sleep finally took her. "He saved us today," she whispered to Maggie, who was still awake beside her. "No," Maggie murmured back. "He began saving us. Today was only the start." By the second morning, the trail had begun to widen. Maggie took the opportunity to sort, through the small bundle of belongings she'd managed to grab, before the auction, the last scraps of their old life, wrapped in a shawl, that still smelled faintly of their mother. A comb. A cracked mirror. Their father's Bible, spine broken from years of use. And tucked inside the Bible's back cover, folded so many times the creases had gone soft, a letter. She almost didn't open it. Almost let it stay folded, the way so many things about their father had stayed folded, since his death. Except her hands moved, before her mind gave permission, because some part of her already suspected there was a reason it had been hidden instead of burned. The ink had faded. Half the words were smudged past reading. But enough remained. "I will not sell the water rights. Not to you. Not to any man who thinks a signature can be bought with a threat. You may tell your employer." The rest was torn away. Deliberately torn, not worn by time. Maggie's mind started running, before she could stop it. Because that was the trouble, with a mind like hers. It never waited for permission. Father wrote this. Which meant someone read it, before it got torn. Which meant someone wanted the rest of it gone. Except why keep half a letter at all, if you meant to destroy the truth in it? Unless the tearing wasn't about hiding it, from the world. Maybe it was about hiding it from himself. so he wouldn't have to look at what he already knew. She sat very still for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly in her fingers. Because their father had died suddenly. 6 months ago. A fall, they'd been told. A fall from a horse he'd ridden 1,000 times, without incident, on land he knew better than his own hands. And now here was a letter. Half destroyed. Refusing to sell something to somebody powerful enough to be called an employer. She didn't say anything to her sisters. Not yet. Because saying it out loud would make it real, and some truths needed a little more time in the dark, before a person could carry them into the light. But that night, when Garrett stepped away to check the horses, Maggie followed. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Garrett didn't turn, but his shoulders shifted, listening. "Go on." "Cornelius Vane. The man you mentioned. What does he want with land out here?" Garrett's hands went still on the saddle strap. "Why do you ask?" "Because I found something," Maggie said. "Among my father's things. A letter. About water rights. About refusing to sell to someone's employer." The silence that followed lasted long enough, that Maggie began to wonder if she'd made a mistake. "Your father's dead 6 months, Garrett said finally. Quiet. Careful. How'd he die?" "A fall. From his horse." Garrett turned to face her fully now, and something dark had settled behind his ice-pale eyes. "Vane doesn't ask twice," he said. "And he doesn't like the word no." Something cold slid through Maggie's chest. Because she'd hoped, foolishly, that he'd tell her she was imagining things. That grief was making ghosts out of ordinary tragedy. He didn't tell her that. "I'm not saying it's connected," Garrett said. "I'm saying don't go looking for that particular truth alone. Not yet." "Why not?" "Because some truths bite back," he said, "before you're ready to hold them." Maggie held the letter a little tighter after that. Said nothing more that night. But she didn't sleep much either, staring up at a sky full of more stars than she'd ever seen, from Silverbend, turning one name over and over in her mind like a stone she couldn't put down. Cornelius Vane. Dawn on the third day came gray and cold, mist still clinging to the pines. They'd barely broken camp, when Garrett went rigid in the saddle, head turning toward the trail behind them. "Down," he said. "Quiet. Absolute. Off the trail. Now." Nobody argued. 4 sisters and 5 horses melted into the tree line, and Eleanor's heart hammered, so loud she was certain it could be heard, over the wind. Because somewhere behind them, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of riders. Not many. 2, maybe 3. Moving at a pace too careful to be travelers minding their own business. Garrett's hand rested on his rifle, without lifting it. Waiting. Watching the bend in the trail, with the same flat, patient stillness Eleanor had seen in the man back at the auction yard, the one in the dark coat. The riders passed below them on the lower trail. 2 men, unremarkable at a distance, saying nothing to each other, eyes fixed forward like men, with somewhere specific to be. They didn't slow. Didn't look up into the trees. And within a minute the sound of their horses had faded back, into the ordinary hush of the forest. Garrett didn't move for a long moment after. Long enough that Charlotte finally whispered, "Was that?" "Don't know," Garrett said. Which wasn't the same as no. He didn't explain further. Just swung back, onto the trail once the woods had gone properly silent again, and the sisters followed, quieter now, more watchful, because something in the set of his shoulders had told them this wasn't the last time riders would come looking down that road. Maggie caught Eleanor's eye. Neither of them said the name out loud. They didn't have to. Cornelius Vane had a long reach. And Silverbend, it seemed, was not so far behind them, as the miles suggested. The third morning, the trail widened, into a valley, that looked less like a place, and more like a promise. The Bitterroot Range rose blue, and jagged on one side. On the other, fields rolled out gold, and green, dotted with cattle, that grazed like they'd never once known fear. And at the heart of it all sat a ranch house the size of a small fort. Thick logs. A stone chimney standing proud against the sky. Garrett reined in at the ridge. "Home," he said. Simple as that. The sisters stared. Eleanor's usual fire dimmed for a moment, replaced by something closer to disbelief. "You built all this?" she asked. "Over 20 years," Garrett said. "Some of it was already here, when I bought the land. Most of it's mine. Barns. Smokehouse. Corrals. There's a schoolhouse too, out past the east pasture." His voice softened, just slightly. "Empty, though. No children around." "No family," Maggie said, and it wasn't quite a question. Garrett didn't answer that one either. Charlotte exhaled, eyes shining. "It looks like a place that could let someone breathe again." Adeline said nothing. But her shoulders, hunched tight since the auction, had finally begun to loosen. Her gaze lifted, from her own boots for the first time all day, landing instead on the windows catching the morning light. "Let's get you inside," Garrett said. "You'll eat. Rest. Then we'll sort work and rooms." When they rode into the yard, a few ranch hands paused their chores to stare. Not in mockery. In something closer to surprise. Respect, even, when they recognized the man riding home, with 4 women under his protection. "Don't mind them," Garrett murmured. "I don't hire men who can't keep their hands and their tongues to themselves." That small assurance eased something in Eleanor's spine that had been coiled tight since Silverbend. Inside, the house was enormous. Real glass in the windows. Polished wood floors. A staircase climbing up into shadow. The air smelled of pine, and wood smoke and something older, something like memory pressed deep, into the walls. Garrett stood aside, letting them enter first. "This will be your home," he said. "As long as you want it." Eleanor's steps were cautious. Maggie's were reverent. Charlotte trailed her fingers along a table's smooth surface like she was checking whether it was actually real. Adeline paused at the threshold a long moment, before finally crossing it. 6 bedrooms, Garrett said. 3 upstairs. You'll decide how to divide them. We'll share, Eleanor said, defaulting to leadership out of old habit. At least at first. Good, Garrett said. No rush. This house has been empty too long. He walked them through the kitchen, stocked full. The dining room, where he ran a hand across the long table like he was remembering laughter that hadn't echoed there in decades. The parlor, with a hearth wide enough for a man to stand inside. It's all yours to use, he said. Charlotte blinked at him. We're not servants. No, Garrett said. Final. Not loud, but final. You'll work, because it's a working ranch. But you're not servants. You're not possessions. A pause. You're people I brought here, because you needed a place. And because I need help running 3,000 acres. Maggie glanced at her sisters. We can do that, she said. All of it. We're hard workers. Garrett gave a slow nod. I know. He left them to explore the upstairs, while he put water on to boil. When they reached the landing, the sight of real beds, real quilts, real windows with real curtains, did something to each of them, that none of them had words for. Charlotte sank onto a mattress, and broke into tears. Her sisters rushed to her, but she waved them off, shaking her head, sobbing, I can't believe this is ours. After everything. I can't believe it. Eleanor gathered her into her arms. We're safe, Charlotte, she whispered. For the first time in a long time. We're safe. Downstairs, the kettle whistled. Garrett poured tea, strong and dark, unfamiliar in his own big hands. 20 years since he'd boiled water for anyone but himself. When the sisters came down, faces washed, hair combed, shoulders straighter, he handed each a steaming tin cup. Charlotte took hers with both hands. "Thank you. Tea settles the nerves," Garrett said, clearing his throat. "Least, that's what my wife used to say." The name he didn't say hung in the air like a held breath. Eleanor's eyes flicked to his. "Your wife," she said quietly. "And my daughter," Garrett said. "Lost them a long time ago." Silence followed. Not an uncomfortable kind. "We won't ask," Maggie said gently, "unless you want to tell." He nodded. That, too, seemed to land, as an unexpected mercy. After tea, Eleanor asked the question that mattered most. "What do you want us to start with?" Garrett considered them. "For women, weary but unbroken." "You choose," he said. "Tell me what you're good at. What you enjoy. We'll build the work around that." Eleanor blinked. "Men never ask what we enjoy." "Men you've known haven't asked," Garrett said. "I ain't them." Maggie stepped forward, surprising even herself. "I'm good with numbers. Books. Teaching, if there's ever a need for it." Garrett's brow lifted. "Teaching. My father taught me Greek. Latin. Mathematics." She stopped, suddenly afraid she'd said too much. "Then you'll run the ranch ledgers," Garrett said simply. "And teach any children who come through here." Maggie's breath left her all at once. "Just like that. Just like that." Charlotte raised her hand, half a habit, from schoolroom days. "I'm good at healing. Helping people. We always need a healer." Adeline, still trembling, whispered, "I paint." Something in Garrett's eyes warmed, just slightly. "Then we'll find you a room, with good light." Adeline nearly cried. Later, before supper, Garrett led her down a short hallway to a small room facing west, windows tall enough to catch the whole burning stretch of evening sky. Dust motes hung in the light like something suspended out of time. "This do," he asked, "for painting?" Adeline stepped inside slowly, afraid to breathe too hard in case the room turned out to be a dream she'd wake from. "It's perfect," she whispered. Garrett nodded once, gruff, already turning to leave. But at the doorway he paused. "Used to be a sewing room," he said. Quiet. Almost to himself. "Nobody's used it in a long while." He didn't say whose. Adeline didn't ask. But she understood, standing there in that dying gold light, that he'd just handed her a piece of a story he hadn't told anyone in 20 years, and trusted her, a stranger of one day, not to break it. She promised herself, silently, that she wouldn't. Eleanor crossed her arms. "I'm strong. I can work horses. My father taught me before he died." Garrett's mouth shifted, the smallest crack of something that might have been a smile. "Then you'll take charge of the remuda." Eleanor swallowed. The job was enormous. Important. Respected. "You trust me with that." "If I didn't," Garrett said, "I wouldn't have offered." The sisters exchanged glances, breathless, disbelieving. For the first time in their adult lives, a man had asked what they wanted. Had believed they were capable of more than servitude. Before supper, Eleanor walked out to the corral alone. Needed air. Needed a minute, where nobody was watching her face for cracks. Garrett was already there, forking hay, and he didn't stop working, when she leaned against the fence rail beside him. "You're good with them," she said, nodding at the horses. "The way you talk to us. Same as you talk to them. Slow. Patient. Like you're not expecting either of us to bolt. Startled things bolt, Garrett said. Whether they've got 4 legs or 2. Eleanor almost smiled. Almost. Is that what we are to you? Startled things. Garrett set down the fork. Looked at her properly for the first time, since they'd ridden in, and something in that look made Eleanor's chin lift on instinct, bracing for judgment the way it always braced, out of 26 years of habit she couldn't unlearn in 3 days. No, he said. You're the strongest woman I've met in longer than I care to count. I just figure even strong things deserve a little patience, once in a while. Nobody ever gave you that. I aim to. Eleanor didn't have an answer for that. For once in her life, words failed her completely, and she stood there in the fading light saying nothing at all, while something long frozen in her chest began, very carefully, to thaw. That evening, while Garrett saw to the horses, the sisters claimed their rooms upstairs. 3 bedrooms. 4 women. Which meant somebody had to share, and nobody wanted to be the one to say it first. I'll share with Charlotte, Eleanor announced, the way she announced most things, like the matter was already settled, before anyone else opened their mouth. Convenient, Maggie said dryly, dropping her bundle onto the nearest bed. Since Charlotte snores, and you're too stubborn to admit you'll miss the sound. I do not miss it. You cried the first night Father made us sleep in separate rooms, Charlotte said. You were 11. I was tired. You were 11, and you missed your sister's snoring. Adeline actually laughed at that, quick and startled, like the sound had escaped, before she could catch it. She clapped a hand over her own mouth, eyes wide, as if laughing too loud might undo something fragile in the walls around them. Go on, Maggie told her, gentle. It's allowed. We're allowed to laugh now. Adeline lowered her hand slowly. Like she was testing whether the ceiling might fall in. It didn't. I keep waiting, she admitted, quiet, for someone to tell me to stop. To be quiet. To make myself small again. Eleanor crossed the room, and pulled her into a hug, before the girl could finish the thought. Nobody's telling you that here, Eleanor said. Not ever again. Charlotte pressed her palm flat against the quilt on her new bed, feeling the stitching, the weight of it, real cloth over real cotton. Do you think he means it? She asked. All of it. The rooms. The work. The choosing. I think, Maggie said slowly, turning that same careful, cataloging mind toward the only puzzle in the house, that actually mattered, that a man doesn't build 6 bedrooms in a house he lives alone in, unless some part of him has been waiting 20 years for exactly this. To fill it. Nobody argued with that. Because it felt too true to argue with. After rooms and jobs were settled for the following morning, Garrett lingered awkwardly in the doorway. You 4 should rest, he said. It's been a hard few days. Adeline hesitated. What about you? I'll sleep in my own room. Same as always. But you've given us everything, Charlotte whispered. What can we give you? Garrett paused. When he spoke, his voice came low. Make this house a home again. Then he stepped out to check on the horses, leaving 4 sisters standing in the golden light of a beginning none of them had dared to imagine, that morning at the auction. Back in Silverbend, 3 days' ride, and a whole world away, Jacob Hargrove sat in the back room of the saloon counting his $500 for the 3rd time. Because counting it felt better than thinking about what came next. The door opened without a knock. The man in the dark coat stepped inside. Unhurried. The same man who'd watched the auction, from the edge of the yard, though Hargrove didn't know that. Didn't know much of anything, except that this man worked for the one creditor in the territory a person did not want knocking on his door. Mr. Vane sends his regards, the man said. Hargrove's hand froze over the coins. Tell him he'll have his money by the week's end. Every dollar. He knows that. The man pulled out a chair uninvited, and sat, slow, like he owned the room, and every second inside it. What he wants to know is, who bought the girls? Some rancher. Cole. Why's that his concern? The man's expression didn't change. Which was somehow worse than if it had. Because Mr. Vane takes an interest in anyone who spends $500 on impulse. Men with that kind of money lying around tend to have land worth looking at. Hargrove's stomach turned over. I don't know anything about his land. Didn't ask if you knew. The man stood, straightened his coat, and set a folded slip of paper on the table beside the coins. Mr. Vane just wants you to remember something. You still owe him considerably more than $500. And debts, Mr. Hargrove, have a way of getting collected. He left as quietly as he'd come. Hargrove sat alone in the back room while after, staring at the paper he was too afraid to unfold, sweat beating cold at his collar despite the July heat pressing through the walls. Outside, he could hear the ordinary sounds of a town that had no idea what it had just witnessed. A dog barking. A wagon wheel creaking past. Laughter drifting up from the saloon's front room, careless and light, the kind of laughter that belonged to men who had never once had to sell someone they loved to survive. Because he already knew, in the sick, sinking way a man knows his own cowardice, that this wasn't finished. That selling his nieces had bought him nothing but time. And that time, where Cornelius Vane was concerned, always ran out faster than a man expected. Faster, and crueler, than Jacob Hargrove had ever once let himself imagine. But out beyond the ridge, where the last light was folding into the mountains, a rider sat motionless on a dark horse, watching the ranch house, with its windows now glowing warm against the coming night. He didn't move for a long while. Just watched. Counted the horses in the corral. Counted the smoke rising from the chimney. Counted, in his own quiet way, the cost of everything that now stood on land Cornelius Vane had wanted for a very long time. Then he turned his horse, unhurried, and rode back the way he'd come, hooves fading soft, into the dark, until even that small sound belonged to the mountains again. Because some debts, everyone in that territory would soon learn, always came due. And Garrett Cole, for all his strength, had no idea, yet how much this one was about to cost him. Not yet. Not for a while longer. Autumn came fast that year. Because it always did, in the Bitterroot, like the mountains got tired of waiting, and just took the season by force. 6 weeks. That was all it took for a house to stop feeling borrowed, and start feeling owned. Eleanor rose before dawn now, same as Garrett, boots on before her eyes were fully open, out to the corral, where the remuda waited like they'd been expecting her all along. Maggie's ledgers filled, with neat columns, numbers finally behaving themselves under a hand that understood them. Charlotte's little infirmary off the kitchen smelled of dried yarrow and beeswax, and half the ranch hands found reasons to need doctoring that didn't quite hold up under close inspection. Adeline's west-facing room filled slowly with canvases. Mountains. Horses. A ranch house that looked, in her careful brushstrokes, less like a building, and more like a promise finally kept. And Garrett. Garrett watched all of it happen the way a man watches whether he's stopped believing in, half convinced it'll turn to storm, before the day's out. Because that's what 20 years alone does to a man. Teaches him that good things arrive right, before the bad ones. Teaches him not to trust the quiet. He should have listened to himself. 3 weeks in, Garrett took Eleanor and Charlotte into Silverbend for supplies, the first time either sister had set foot back in that town since the auction. Eleanor rode in stiff-backed, braced for the same sneering faces, the same laughter rolling off the boardwalk like dirty water. It didn't come. Not the way she remembered. The general store owner nodded at her like she was any other customer settling an account. A woman outside the milliner's shop, one who'd stood in that crowd back in July, met Eleanor's eyes for half a second, and looked away first, something like shame flickering across her face, before she ducked inside. Even the men loafing outside the saloon quieted, when Garrett's shadow fell across the boardwalk, though whether that was respect for him, or fear of him, Eleanor couldn't have said, and wasn't sure it mattered. "They're different," Charlotte murmured, loading a crate of dried goods into the wagon. "Or we are." "Maybe both," Eleanor said. "Maybe cruelty only works when nobody's watching. Who does the standing up?" Garrett said nothing, but he walked half a step closer to both of them the rest of the way down the street, and Eleanor understood that silence for exactly what it was. A kind of shield a man builds, without ever once calling it that. They passed the auction yard on the way out of town. Empty now, the platform bleached pale by 3 weeks of sun, no trace left of the day it had nearly cost them everything. Eleanor looked at it a long moment, from the wagon seat. "You all right?" Garrett asked. "I keep waiting for it to still hurt," she said. "The way it did that day." "Does it?" She considered the question honestly, the way she'd learned to consider most things, since arriving at his ranch. "Less," she admitted. "Every week, a little less." "Good," Garrett said. "That's how it's supposed to work." The rider came on a Tuesday. Gray sky, first frost still silvering the grass, and Eleanor was the one who spotted him first, same as she'd spotted the dust cloud outside Silverbend all those weeks ago. "Garrett." Her voice carried flat across the yard. "Someone's coming." He was at her side, before the words finished landing. One rider. Alone, badge glinting dull under an overcast sky, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who didn't expect trouble, and wasn't bringing any himself. Just paperwork. Which, Garrett had learned a long time ago, could be worse than trouble. The deputy reined in at the yard's edge, young, sunburned, clearly uncomfortable with whatever errand had sent him 3 days out from town. "Mr. Cole." He didn't dismount. "Got a notice for you." "From the county." "Whose notice?" "Filed by Jacob Hargrove." The deputy's throat worked. "Says you took his nieces off his property under false pretense. Says the sale wasn't legal. Says he wants them back." Silence. The kind that has weight to it. The kind that presses down on a chest, until breathing takes effort. Eleanor's hands curled into fists at her sides. "He sold us." "That's what he's disputing, ma'am." The deputy wouldn't meet her eyes. "Says the money was for back wages. Says he never meant to give up guardianship." "Guardianship." Maggie's voice, arriving from the porch, sharp enough to cut. "We are not children. Law don't much care about that distinction when there's no husband, and no father living," the deputy said. "Next of kin holds the claim, unless a judge rules otherwise." Garrett hadn't moved. Hadn't spoken. But something in him had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he already knew the answer to, and hated every figure in it. "Who's paying for the lawyer?" he said. Quiet. The deputy blinked. "Sir?" Hargrove's never had 2 nickels to rub together in his life. Filing a county claim costs money. Lawyers' fees cost money. Garrett's jaw tightened. "So who's paying?" The deputy shifted in his saddle, and that shifting told Garrett everything the boy wasn't brave enough to say out loud. "I wouldn't know anything about that, sir." "No," Garrett said. "I don't expect you would." That night, the sisters gathered around the long dining table, the notice sitting in the center of it like something venomous nobody wanted to touch first. "He can't just take us," Charlotte said, and her voice wavered on the word taken away, that made Eleanor's stomach hurt. "He can try," Maggie said. "Because trying costs him nothing. Vane's paying for the lawyer. Which means Vane wants this fight to happen. Which means Vane wants something out of it, that has nothing to do with Uncle Jacob getting his nieces back." "The land," Eleanor said. The land, Maggie agreed. Or the water on it. Or both. Adeline hugged her knees to her chest at the end of the table. Why would he want this ranch? It's not even near Father's old property. Garrett, standing by the window, with his back to all of them, finally spoke. Because if he can prove you're still legal wards of Hargrove, he said, and Hargrove's in his pocket, then whatever land you'd have inherited becomes Vane's problem to solve, not yours. Water rights don't die with your father. They pass down. To you. He turned. Which means you're not the prize here. You never were. You're the key. The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season. Then what does he want, with your land? Eleanor asked. You don't have anything of ours. Garrett didn't answer for a long moment. I've got something older than that, he said finally. Older than your father's claim. Older than most grudges in this territory. What? Eleanor said. Ask me again, Garrett said, when I'm ready to answer it. She didn't push. Not that night. But she watched him walk out to the barn alone, rifle in hand, though there was nothing out there, yet worth shooting. It was Adeline who found the box. Not on purpose. She'd gone looking for turpentine among the barn's back shelves, and there it was, a small wooden box shoved behind a coil of rope like a man had wanted it close, but not looked at, open this time, like he'd forgotten to hide his grief properly for once. Inside, a carved wooden horse, small enough to fit a child's palm. A woman's hair comb, tortoiseshell, one tooth broken. And a single sheet of paper, brittle with age, folded so many times it had nearly torn itself along the creases. She shouldn't have read it. Except her eyes had already caught the date at the top, before her conscience caught up with her hands, and by then it was too late to unsee it. 18 years ago. A name she didn't recognize, signed at the bottom of what looked like a deed. And beneath it, in different ink, added later, in handwriting gone jagged, with something that might have been rage, or might have been grief, they said it was an accident. It was not an accident. The barn door creaked. Adeline dropped the letter like it had burned her. Garrett stood in the doorway, backlit by the gray afternoon, and for one terrible second neither of them moved. I wasn't, she started. I know, he said. Quiet. Tired in a way that went bone deep. You weren't the first person to go looking for answers I never gave. Won't be the last. Garrett. She said his name like an apology. What happened to them? He crossed the barn slowly. Picked up the box. Closed it, this time without the sharpness of before, like some of the fight had gone out of hiding it. 18 years ago, he said, I had a ranch smaller than this one. Wife. Daughter, 3 years old. He paused. And water on my land, that a man named Cornelius Vane wanted for his cattle operation. I said no. Adeline's breath caught. Vane. Same man, Garrett said. Younger. Hungrier. Not yet as careful about how he collected what he wanted. His hands tightened on the box. There was a fire. Started in the barn, middle of the night, wind wrong, spread to the house, before I could get them both out. His voice didn't break. It just went very flat, the way a man's voice goes, when he's told a story, so many times to himself, that the words have worn smooth, like river stone. They ruled it an accident. Lantern left burning too close to the hay. But you don't believe that. I found boot prints in the mud the next morning. 2 sets. Neither of them mine, neither of them my ranch hands. He looked at her. By the time I thought to ask questions, the trail had gone cold, and Vane had already bought the land off my neighbor for less than it was worth, on account of the water now being easier to get to, since half my fence line burned down, with everything else. Adeline's hand pressed against her own mouth. 18 years, and he's still doing it. Men like Vane don't stop, Garrett said. They just get better at not leaving prints. He set the box back on the shelf. Didn't hide it this time. Does Eleanor know? Adeline asked. Any of it? No. Are you going to tell her? Garrett was quiet a long moment. When I'm ready, he said, echoing his own words back at her, from the dining table. Not before. Adeline nodded. And something in her chest, some small fierce thing, that had been growing, since the auction, decided right then, that she would guard this secret like it was her own. Because a man, who carried grief, that heavy for 18 years, without once asking anyone to carry it, with him deserved, at the very least, to choose the moment he finally set it down. Amos Whitfield had worked the Cole ranch for 6 years. Long enough that Garrett trusted him, with keys to the smokehouse, with the tally of cattle come branding season, with the kind of quiet authority a foreman needs to run things, when the owner's occupied elsewhere. Long enough that nobody thought twice, when he rode, into Silverbend every second Tuesday for supplies. Nobody except Maggie, who had started thinking twice about everything, since the day she'd found her father's torn letter. It was the frequency that bothered her first. Twice a month, regular as a clock, regardless of whether the ranch actually needed anything. Then it was the money. Small sums missing, from the general accounts, amounts too modest to catch a careless eye, but Maggie's eye had never once been careless. She said nothing. Just watched. Counted. The same way she'd counted rifles, and exits back on, that auction platform, because watching quietly had always been the only power she had, and it had never once failed her yet. The morning Whitfield rode out for supplies, Maggie found a reason to be near the trailhead, mending a fence, that didn't strictly need mending. She watched him take the North Fork instead of the town road. The North Fork led nowhere useful. Except toward the Vane land office, 40 minutes further on. She didn't follow. She was careful, not reckless. But she rode back to the house, with her thoughts churning ugly, and that evening, when Garrett came in, from the fields, she pulled him aside before supper. I need to tell you something, she said. And I need you not to do anything foolish about it, until we're certain. Garrett's expression went carefully blank, the look of a man bracing for weight, before it's even set on his shoulders. Go on. Whitfield's riding to Vane's office. Not town. I watched him take the North Fork twice now. Something in Garrett's face shifted. Not surprise exactly. More like a puzzle piece sliding into a socket he'd suspected was there all along. How long? He said. I don't know. I only started watching 2 weeks ago. Garrett's jaw worked. He's the only one who knew the schedule for moving cattle to the upper pasture last month. The only one who knew which nights I ride the fence line alone. His voice dropped. The only one who could tell somebody exactly when this house is least defended. Maggie felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. You think he's the reason those riders were on our trail? Back before we even reached the ranch. I think, Garrett said, slow and careful, like each word cost him something, that I need proof, before I accuse a man I've trusted 6 years. Because if I'm wrong, I lose a good foreman over nothing. And if I'm right. If you're right, Maggie finished, we've been feeding information to Cornelius Vane every second Tuesday, since the day we arrived. Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. The fire cracked in the hearth. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters like something knocking, patient, waiting to be let in. Don't confront him, Maggie said finally. Not yet. Let him think nobody's watching. Men careless enough to get caught once usually get careless twice. Garrett looked at her, with something that might have been respect. You'd have made a fine lawyer. I'd have made a fine anything, Maggie said, if anyone had ever bothered to ask what I wanted before now. Sheriff Callum Boone rode out to the Cole ranch 3 days later, and everything about his arrival felt wrong, before he even opened his mouth. Because sheriffs didn't ride 3 days out from town over a civil dispute. Not unless somebody with money had made it worth the trip. He dismounted in the yard, hat low, badge catching the weak autumn light, and something in his posture read careful in a way Eleanor didn't trust. Careful men, in her limited, but hard-earned experience, were usually careful, because they had something to hide. Mr. Cole. Boone's voice was even, practiced. Come about the Hargrove filing. Come to serve it, Garrett said, or come to talk me out of fighting it. Come to tell you a judge in the county seats agreed to hear it. 2 weeks' time. Boone's eyes moved, over the sisters standing on the porch, lingering half a second too long on each face, like he was memorizing something for later. Recommend you have good counsel by then. Hargrove's got himself a sharp one. Paid for by Vane, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Boone's expression didn't so much as flicker. Couldn't say where a man's money comes from, ma'am. Ain't my business. Isn't it, Maggie said. You're the sheriff. I'm the sheriff of Silverbend, Boone said. Not the territory's conscience. He swung back up into his saddle. 2 weeks, Cole. I'd get that counsel. He rode off, without another word, and Eleanor watched him go, with a knot of dread tightening low in her chest. He knows more than he's saying, she said. Everybody in this territory knows more than they're saying, Garrett replied. Questions whether any of them are brave enough to say it out loud, when it matters. The 2 weeks that followed felt like standing in the eye of something enormous, gathering strength just out of sight. Garrett rode to town twice for a lawyer of his own, both times coming back grim and tight-lipped, because it turned out every attorney worth hiring in 3 counties had already been retained, quietly, by interests nobody would name. Vane's reach, Maggie realized with a cold, sinking certainty, wasn't just long. It was patient. It had been laying groundwork for this long, before the auction ever happened. Which meant none of this was really about Hargrove at all. Hargrove was a puppet, dancing on strings he didn't even realize were attached to his wrists. Eleanor found Garrett alone in the barn one evening, running an oiled cloth over his rifle, with the same slow, deliberate care he gave everything. You're scared, she said. Not an accusation. Just an observation, the kind she'd learned to make, since arriving here, careful and unflinching, the way he'd taught her, without ever meaning to teach her anything. Man who says he isn't, Garrett said, is a man who hasn't got anything left to lose. And you do. He looked up at her then, and something passed between them, that neither one had words ready for yet. Something new. Something that hadn't existed 6 weeks ago on a dusty auction platform, back when she was cargo, and he was a stranger, with too much money, and a grudge against cruelty. Yeah, Garrett said, quiet. I do. Eleanor's breath caught. Because she understood exactly what he meant, and the understanding terrified her almost, as much as Vane's lawyers did. We're not going anywhere, she said. Whatever that judge decides. Whatever Hargrove tries. That's not up to us, Garrett said. Not entirely. Then make it up to us, Eleanor said, fierce now, the old fire flaring back to life behind her eyes. You didn't buy us out of that yard to hand us back, over a piece of paper. Garrett set the rifle down. Stood. No, he said. I didn't. And for one long moment, standing in the lamplight, with sawdust and horse, and gun oil thick in the air, neither of them moved, until Eleanor finally stepped back first, because some things needed more time, before they could be trusted, even good things. Especially good things. The following evening, Garrett found her at the corral fence again, and this time he came carrying 2 rifles instead of 1. You know how to use one of these, he asked, holding the second out to her. My father taught me to shoot rabbits, Eleanor said. Never a man. Hope you never have to learn the difference the hard way. Garrett set up a row of tin cans along the fence rail, unhurried, like teaching a woman to defend herself was as ordinary as teaching her to ride. But if Vane sends more men than paperwork, I want you able to hold your own. All 4 of you. Eleanor lifted the rifle, testing its weight against her shoulder the way he showed her. Her first shot went wide, kicking up dirt a foot short of the cans, and she muttered something under her breath sharp enough to make Garrett's mouth twitch. Again, he said. Elbow up. Breathe out slow before you pull. Her second shot clipped the edge of a can, sending it spinning. Her third knocked it clean off the rail. There it is, Garrett said, something almost like pride warming his voice. Don't sound so surprised. Not surprised, Garrett said. Just glad. A man likes knowing the woman he's falling for can take care of herself, same as she takes care of everybody else. Eleanor lowered the rifle slowly, heat rising in her cheeks, that had nothing to do with the evening sun. Did you just say what I think you said? Garrett's ears went faintly red beneath the scar. Might have. Might have, Eleanor repeated, fighting a smile she refused to let win outright. That's not much of a confession, Garrett Cole. Best I've got for tonight, he said. Man's rusty. Give it time. I intend to, Eleanor said, and handed the rifle back to him, fingers brushing his just a moment longer than necessary, before either of them found a reason to look away first. Maggie's patience with Whitfield paid off on a cold Thursday evening, 10 days before the hearing. She'd taken to watching the smokehouse at odd hours, on instinct more than evidence, and that instinct was rewarded, when she saw Whitfield slip inside long, after the other hands had gone to supper, a folded paper in his hand, that had no business existing, if his errands were as innocent as he claimed. She waited until he'd gone. Then searched the smokehouse herself, hands trembling with a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction, until she found what he'd hidden behind a loose board near the salt barrels. A ledger. Not the ranch's ledger, her ledger, the one she kept herself, meticulous and complete. This was a second one. Smaller. In Whitfield's own cramped hand. Dates. Cattle movements. The number of hands on the property each night. And, worse, a rough sketch of the house itself, doors and windows marked, with small notations, that made her blood run cold. She brought it straight to Garrett. He read it in silence at the kitchen table, sisters gathered around him, the lamp throwing long shadows across a page, that amounted to nothing less than a map for anyone planning to take this house by force. 6 years, Garrett said, low. 6 years I fed that man at my own table. What do we do? Charlotte whispered. Garrett closed the ledger slowly. We wait, he said. One more day. Let him think he's still invisible. His jaw set, hard as the scar running down it. Then we make sure he understands exactly how visible he's been the whole time. Eleanor watched him, and for the first time, since the auction, she saw something in his face that frightened her a little. Not because it was cruel. Because it was patient, and controlled, and entirely certain of what came next. The confrontation, when it came, arrived faster than anyone expected. Because Whitfield, it turned out, wasn't quite as patient as the men he answered to. He'd sent word ahead the moment he realized his ledger had gone missing, panicked, certain his usefulness to Vane was the only thing keeping him safe from Garrett's wrath, and desperate men made desperate choices. They came at dusk, 6 days before the hearing. 4 riders, none of them wearing badges, all of them carrying rifles like men who'd used them before and would again, without much hesitation. Eleanor spotted them first, same as always, dust rising along the North Fork Road, the same road Whitfield had ridden a dozen times unnoticed. Riders, she called, and this time there was no mistaking the fear underneath the word. 4 of them. Armed. Garrett was already moving. Inside. All of you. Now. We're not hiding, Eleanor snapped, old instinct flaring even through the fear. "This isn't the moment to argue with me," Garrett said, and something in his voice, low and absolute, made even Eleanor's stubbornness bend. "Just this once." The sisters retreated to the porch, Charlotte gripping Adeline's hand, so tight her knuckles went white, Maggie already counting the riders, the distance, the odds, the way she always did, when the world narrowed down to only what could be survived. The riders reined in at the edge of the yard. The lead man, broad-shouldered, cold-eyed, didn't bother dismounting. "Cole." His voice carried flat across the yard. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Hargrove. Come to collect his nieces pending the county's ruling." "There's no ruling yet," Garrett said. "Hearing's not for 6 days." "Mr. Hargrove's grown concerned for their welfare in the meantime," the man said, and something in the practiced flatness of it told Garrett this speech had been written for him by someone with considerably more education than Jacob Hargrove had ever possessed. "We'd prefer this go easy." "Then leave," Garrett said. "That's the easiest version there is." The lead rider's hand drifted toward the rifle across his saddle. "That's not the version we came for." Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. Because this wasn't paperwork anymore. This wasn't lawyers, and filings, and careful sheriff's visits. This was 4 armed men in her yard at dusk, and 1 man standing between them, and everything she, and her sisters had only just begun to call home. "Last chance," Garrett said. "Ride out." The rider's hand closed around his rifle stock. Everything happened at once. A shot cracked across the yard, and for 1 suspended, horrifying second Eleanor couldn't tell whose gun had fired first. Garrett staggered, a line of red blooming fast along his upper arm, and Charlotte screamed, and Maggie was already moving toward the rifle kept by the door, because someone in this family had learned, the hard way, that survival didn't wait for permission. Garrett didn't go down. Didn't even slow. He returned fire once, precise, and the lead rider's horse reared hard enough to nearly throw him, and in the chaos of dust, and shouting, and horses screaming, the 4 riders wheeled, and broke for the tree line, having gotten considerably more resistance than whoever sent them had promised. Silence fell, sharp and sudden, broken only by Garrett's ragged breathing, and the frantic thud of Eleanor's boots crossing the yard toward him. "You're bleeding," she said, voice cracking down the middle of the word. "It's shallow," Garrett said, teeth gritted. "Looks worse than it is." "You don't get to decide that," Eleanor snapped, already tearing a strip from her own sleeve, hands shaking as she pressed it hard against the wound, because panic and fury made surprisingly efficient partners when there was work to be done. Charlotte arrived seconds later, with her bag, pushing Eleanor's hands gently aside, murmuring instructions in the calm, steady voice she used for frightened animals, and frightened people alike, because there wasn't much difference between the two, when the fear ran deep enough. Adeline stood frozen at the porch rail, staring at the tree line, where the riders had vanished, and Maggie stood beside her, rifle still gripped tight in both hands, eyes scanning the dark, with the same relentless, cataloging focus she'd carried since the auction yard. "They'll be back," Maggie said quietly. "I know," Garrett rasped, as Charlotte wound a bandage tight around his arm. "With more men next time." "I know that too." Eleanor knelt beside him, hand pressed flat against his chest like she could hold the whole moment together, through sheer force of will. "Then we need to know everything," she said. "No more waiting for the right time. Whatever you haven't told us. Whatever you're carrying alone. We need it now." Garrett looked at her, pain and something rawer than pain moving behind his eyes. "Cornelius Vane killed my wife, and my daughter," he said. 18 years ago. Over water rights, same as he's after now." His jaw tightened against the pain in his arm. "And I've spent 18 years waiting for the day I'd get to look him in the eye, and make him answer for it." The yard went utterly still. "That day's coming," Garrett said, quieter now, blood soaking slow, through Charlotte's bandage. "Sooner than any of us are ready for." They found Whitfield's horse gone, from the barn, that same night, along with the man himself, and a hastily emptied bunk, that told its own story clear enough. He hadn't run far, though. Not far enough. Because in his haste he'd left behind a second item, tucked beneath his mattress, where he'd clearly believed nobody would think to search. A letter. Unsigned, but written in a hand growing familiar to Maggie now, from cross-referencing county filings at the land office weeks before. Careful, elegant, cold. Confirm the hearing date. Confirm the girl, with the ledger poses no further threat. And confirm Cole understands, before this is finished, precisely whose land he is standing on. Maggie read it twice, 3 times, her hands steady even, as her heart wasn't. He knows about me, she said. Vain. He knows I found something. Then we're not just fighting a custody claim anymore, Eleanor said, grim. We're fighting a man who's already killed once to get what he wants. Twice, Garrett said, from the chair, where Charlotte had made him sit still, arm bound tight, jaw set against the throbbing ache of it. At least twice, that I know of. Silence settled over the kitchen, heavy and cold despite the fire crackling in the hearth. 6 days, Maggie said finally. Until the hearing. 6 days, Garrett agreed, to prove that a judge in that county seat is braver than every lawyer Vane's already bought. And if he isn't, Adeline whispered. Nobody answered that. Because nobody in that kitchen had an answer worth saying out loud. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the first hard bite of the coming winter, and somewhere beyond the ridge, in an office lit warm against the dark, a man who had waited 18 years for water rights he still didn't have was already writing his next letter. Because Cornelius Vane did not lose. Not gracefully. Not ever. And Garrett Cole, bleeding but unbroken at his own kitchen table, understood better than anyone alive exactly what that meant for the 6 days still standing between his family and whatever Vane intended to do next. 6 days. That was the whole of it now. 6 days until a judge in a county seat none of them had ever seen would decide whether 4 sisters belonged to a man who'd sold them like livestock, or to the man who'd bled defending them in his own front yard. Garrett's arm healed slow. Too slow for his liking, though he never once said so out loud. Because saying it out loud would have meant admitting weakness in front of people who'd only just started believing he didn't have any. Charlotte checked the wound every morning, unwinding the bandage, with hands that had gone steadier over these past weeks, more certain, less like a girl playing at healing, and more like a woman who simply healed. Still angry, she said, on the 4th morning, prodding gently at the reddened edge. It's a bullet wound, Garrett said. Supposed to be angry. I meant you. Charlotte didn't look up from her work. Not the arm. Garrett didn't answer that. Which was its own kind of answer. Maggie hadn't slept properly in 4 nights. Because sleep required a mind that would sit still, and hers wouldn't. Not anymore. Not since Whitfield's ledger, not since the unsigned letter, not since every scrap of evidence in this whole ugly business had started arranging itself into a shape she recognized. She spread it all across the kitchen table on the 5th night. The torn half of her father's letter. Whitfield's second ledger. The unsigned note demanding confirmation that she posed no further threat. County land filings Garrett had ridden 2 days to retrieve, copied by hand, from records that weren't supposed to leave the courthouse at all. Eleanor found her there past midnight, lamp burned low, eyes red-rimmed and fixed on the papers like they might rearrange themselves into an answer, if she just stared hard enough. You should sleep, Eleanor said. I should finish this. Maggie. Look. Maggie's finger jabbed at a filing date. Father refused to sell the water rights months before he died. Filed his refusal with the county. Same season Vane filed a competing claim on land 2 miles east, land that only becomes worthless without access to our creek. She looked up, eyes bright with something that wasn't quite triumph, and wasn't quite grief. He needed Father's water. And not so very long after, Father's horse, an animal he'd ridden 1,000 times, without incident, threw him on flat ground in broad daylight. Eleanor sat down slowly across from her sister. "You think Vane killed him?" "I think," Maggie said, "that 18 years ago Vane burned down a rancher's house, over the exact same kind of refusal. And I think men, who get away with something once, rarely feel much reason to stop." The lamp flickered between them. "We can't prove any of it," Eleanor said quietly. "Not in a courtroom. Not with what we've got." "No," Maggie agreed. "Not yet." "Then what good is any of this?" Maggie's jaw set, stubborn in a way that mirrored her sister's own stubbornness, the family trait none of them had managed to starve out of themselves no matter how hard Hargrove had tried. "Because sometimes," she said, "you don't need proof for a judge. You just need enough to make a frightened man crack open in front of one." Adeline painted less that week. Because her hands had started shaking again, the old fear creeping back in around the edges the way frost creeps along a window, and no amount of good light in a west-facing room could talk it back out. She found Garrett in the barn again, box open on the shelf, though this time he wasn't hiding it. Wasn't hiding anything anymore, not from her. "You're not eating," she said. "Not hungry. You're never hungry the week before something terrible happens." She sat on an overturned crate near him, hugging her knees the way she always did, when the world felt too large. "I've started noticing things like that. About you." Garrett almost smiled. "Almost. That's so. You go quiet 3 days before trouble. Like you can smell it coming." She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "Can you smell it now?" Garrett's silence answered before his words did. "Yeah," he said finally. "I can smell it now." "What's it smell like?" He looked at her, something old and tired moving behind those ice-pale eyes. "Smells like 18 years finally catching up to somebody," he said. "I just don't know yet whose neck it lands on. Mine. Or his." Adeline didn't have an answer for that. So she didn't try to find one. She just sat, with him a while longer, in the dust, and the fading light, because some kinds of company didn't need words to matter. The night before they rode for Larkspur, none of the sisters slept much, and somewhere past midnight they gave up pretending otherwise, and gathered instead in Eleanor and Charlotte's room, quilts pulled around their shoulders like they were girls again, back when a bad dream only ever meant climbing into someone else's bed until morning. "What if the judge doesn't believe us?" Charlotte whispered. "Then we make him," Eleanor said. "Same as we've made everything else work since July." Maggie sat cross-legged at the foot of the bed, sharpening a pencil she didn't need sharpened, hands needing something to do besides shake. "I keep running the numbers," she admitted. "Trying to calculate the odds. And I can't. There's no ledger for a man like Vane. No column that balances." "Maybe that's the wrong kind of math," Adeline said, quiet from her spot by the window. "Maybe it's not about odds at all." "Then what is it about?" Maggie asked, almost gentle, almost curious despite the dread sitting heavy in the room. Adeline considered that a long moment, turning her answer, over the way she turned, over color on a canvas, waiting for the right shade to settle. "It's about whether we're still the same 4 girls, who let a man sell us, without a fight," she said finally. "Or whether we've become something he never once accounted for." Nobody spoke for a moment after that. Then Charlotte, because silence never sat right with her for long, allowed herself the smallest, tired laugh. "Since when did you get so wise?" she said. "You used to hide behind us at church." "I still would," Adeline said, "if hiding were still an option." A pause. "It isn't anymore. None of us get to hide. Not since Garrett taught us how it feels to stand in the open instead." Eleanor reached over, and squeezed her youngest sister's hand, the same way she had on that auction platform months ago, except this time the grip wasn't holding anyone back from falling apart. It was holding them all together on purpose. Whatever happens tomorrow, Eleanor said, we walk in there as sisters. Not as anybody's problem to solve. Not as anybody's property, Maggie added. Not as anybody's charity, Charlotte said. Just us, Adeline finished, quiet but certain. Finally, just us. They slept eventually, tangled together in one bed the way they hadn't, since childhood, for sisters who had survived an auction block, and a fire nobody had lit for them, and woke before dawn already dressed, already ready, already something Cornelius Vane's lawyers had never once thought to prepare for. The hearing was held in the county seat of Larkspur, a town twice the size of Silverbend, and twice as full of men who'd already decided how this would end, before a single word of testimony got spoken. Garrett rode in, with all four sisters, Eleanor beside him at the front, chin lifted the way it had been lifted on that auction platform months ago, refusing to let fear settle, where pride could stand instead. The courthouse smelled of varnish, and cigar smoke, and the particular staleness of a room, where important men gathered to decide the fates of people smaller than themselves. Hargrove sat at the plaintiff's table already, thinner than Eleanor remembered, hands twisting in his lap, eyes darting toward the door every few seconds like he expected something worse than his nieces to walk through it. Because he did expect something worse. Eleanor could see that now. Could see it plain, as day and the sweat beading along his collar despite the cold outside. His lawyer, by contrast, sat calm as still water. Expensive coat. Manicured hands. The kind of composure that only comes from a man who's never once had to worry where his next meal was coming from. That's not a Silverbend lawyer, Maggie murmured. No, Garrett said. That's a Vane lawyer wearing a Hargrove name on his papers. The judge entered. Older, tired-eyed, the look of a man who'd presided over 1,000 disputes, and expected this one to be no different than the rest. State your claim, he said to Hargrove's table. The lawyer rose smooth as oil over water. Your Honor, my client seeks the return of his four nieces, wrongfully removed from his guardianship under circumstances he did not fully understand at the time of transaction. Wrongfully removed, Eleanor whispered, fury climbing hot up her throat. We were sold. Order, the judge said, though not unkindly. You'll have your turn, miss. The lawyer continued, smooth, practiced, painting a picture of a grieving uncle taken advantage of by a wealthy rancher who'd exploited a moment of financial desperation. Painting Garrett as the villain. Painting Hargrove as the victim. And the terrible thing, the thing that made Eleanor's throat tighten, with dread, was that it almost sounded believable. Almost sounded true, the way a lie sounds true, when it's been polished by someone paid enough to polish it well. Garrett's own counsel, a modest man, from a modest practice 2 towns over, did what he could. Called Eleanor to testify about the conditions of the sale, and she stood straight-backed in front of the whole courtroom, describing the auction platform, the crowd's laughter, the exact words Hargrove had used to price 4 human beings like cattle at market. Her voice didn't break once, though her hands, gripping the rail in front of her, went white-knuckled by the end of it. Maggie testified next, laying out the ledgers, with the same patient, meticulous clarity she'd once used to catalog rifles, and exits on that same auction platform. The debt Hargrove owed. The timing of the filing, suspiciously precise for a man who claimed only grief had motivated him. The absence of any concern for his niece's welfare across 6 full months of silence, until money and a lawyer arrived, from somewhere he refused to name. Charlotte spoke of the bruises she'd tended on her sisters in the months before the sale, careful and clinical, the kind of testimony that made 2 jurors in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. Even Adeline, trembling so hard Eleanor could see it, from across the room, managed a few halting sentences about the fear that had lived in that house long before any auction block entered the picture. But it wasn't enough. Eleanor could feel it wasn't enough, watching the judge's face stay carefully neutral, watching Hargrove's lawyer smile just slightly every time a point landed soft instead of sharp. Until Garrett rose. "Your Honor," he said. "May I address the court directly?" The judge nodded, wary. Briefly. Garrett turned. Not to the judge. To Hargrove. "Jacob," he said. "Just that. Just the name, quiet, almost gentle, the way you'd speak to a spooked animal you didn't want to startle into running." Hargrove flinched like he'd been struck. "You've been afraid, since the day I met you," Garrett said. "Not of me. Of something bigger than me. I've watched you flinch every time a rider comes up that road, same flinch I've seen on men, who owe money to people, who collect in ways worse than money." He stepped closer. "You didn't file this claim, because you missed your nieces, Jacob. You filed it because somebody told you to. Same somebody who's paying for that lawyer sitting next to you right now." "Objection," the lawyer snapped. "This is speculation, Your Honor." "Is it?" Garrett said, still looking only at Hargrove. "Then tell the court his name, Jacob. Tell them who's really sitting behind you in this room, even though he never once bothered to show his face." Silence. The whole courtroom held its breath. Hargrove's hands were shaking now, visibly, the twisting turned to outright tremor. His eyes darted to his lawyer, who gave the smallest, coldest shake of his head, a warning plain, as a drawn gun. And that warning, Eleanor would think later, was the exact mistake that broke him. Because Hargrove had spent months being threatened quietly, in shadows, in unsigned letters, and careful visits, from men in dark coats. But nobody had ever threatened him out loud, in public, in front of a judge, where the whole shape of his fears suddenly had witnesses. "Cornelius Vane," Hargrove said. The room erupted into murmurs. The judge banged his gavel once, sharp. "Order." "Cornelius Vane," Hargrove said again, louder now, something breaking loose in his chest like a dam finally giving way, after months of pressure. "He's the one who called in my debts. He's the one who told me to file this claim, said he'd forgive everything I owed, if I got the girls back under my name. Said it didn't matter what happened to them, after that, so long as their inheritance stayed tangled up in my guardianship instead of passing clean to them." "Your Honor," the lawyer began, "my client is clearly distressed, and—" "Let him finish," the judge said, sharp now, leaning forward in his chair. Hargrove's voice cracked. "He came to my brother's farm months before he died. Offered to buy the water rights. My brother said no. Vane said everybody regrets saying no to him eventually. He swallowed hard. Weeks later my brother's dead. Fell off a horse he'd ridden 10,000 times without trouble." His eyes filled, whether from guilt, or fear or both, Eleanor couldn't tell anymore. "I knew. God help me, I knew something wasn't right about it, and I sold his daughters anyway, because I was scared of what would happen, if I didn't do exactly what Vane told me to do." The courtroom had gone utterly silent. "You're saying," the judge said slowly, "that you believe Cornelius Vane was responsible for your brother's death." "I'm saying I've been afraid of that man for a year," Hargrove said, weeping openly now, all pretense stripped away. "And I'm saying I'd rather go to prison for what I did to these girls than spend one more day pretending I don't know why my brother really died." Eleanor's hand found Maggie's under the table. Neither of them breathed. Because this was it. This was the crack in the dam Maggie had been waiting for, the confession no ledger or letter could have forced, delivered instead by the one man weak enough to finally break under the weight of his own conscience. The judge called a recess. 20 minutes that felt like 20 years. Garrett found Eleanor in the hallway outside, both of them still trembling slightly, from adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. "He confessed," Eleanor said, half disbelieving. "In front of everyone." "He confessed to his part," Garrett said. "Vane's not in that room." Vane's never in the room when the damage gets done. That's how men like him survive this long. Then what do we do? Garrett's jaw tightened. We make sure this doesn't stay contained to a courthouse in Larkspur, he said. Because Vane's got a lot more at stake than one custody claim now. He's got 18 years of quiet finally coming due. Eleanor searched his face. You think he'll come after us? After this? I think, Garrett said, a cornered animal doesn't retreat quietly. It attacks whatever's closest. And the closest thing to Cornelius Vane, in that moment, was a ranch 3 days' ride away, guarded by nothing but a handful of hands, and a man still healing from a bullet wound. The judge's ruling, when the recess ended, came fast and unambiguous. Guardianship claim dismissed. Custody, such as it existed for 4 grown women, who needed no guardian at all, affirmed as resting, with themselves and no one else. Hargrove remanded for further questioning regarding his brother's death. His testimony entered into the county record as sworn evidence against a man who had not yet been formally charged with anything. Which meant, Garrett understood grimly, as they rode out of Larkspur that same afternoon, that Cornelius Vane now knew exactly how much daylight had just been let in on 20 years of careful, patient crime. And men like Vane did not wait patiently once the daylight arrived. They rode hard for the ranch, faster than the tired horses wanted to go, because Garrett's gut had started twisting somewhere around the 2nd hour outside Larkspur, and he'd learned a long time ago never to argue with that particular feeling. Dusk was falling by the time the valley came into view, and what they saw stopped every heart in that riding party at once. Smoke. Not from the chimney. From the east pasture, where a section of fence had been torn down and set alight, cattle scattered wild across the darkening fields. No, Eleanor breathed. No, no, no. Garrett spurred his horse hard, outpacing the others, and the sisters followed, as fast as their mounts could carry them, hearts hammering, fear a living thing clawing up every throat. They crested the ridge to find the yard full of riders. Not for this time. Closer to a dozen, armed, positioned like men who'd planned this for longer than the few hours since a courtroom recess in Larkspur. And at the center of them, sitting a black horse, with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life feared consequence, sat Cornelius Vane himself. Older than Garrett expected. Silver at the temples, a face more suited to a banker's office than a range war, and eyes that carried the same flat, patient cruelty Garrett had glimpsed once before, 18 years ago, in the reflection of flames eating through everything he'd loved. Mr. Cole, Vane said, voice smooth as poured cream. You've caused me considerably more trouble than 4 fat farm girls should ever be worth. Charlotte flinched at the words. Adeline went white. But Eleanor's spine straightened, and something in her eyes went hard as flint. You don't get to talk about my sisters, she said. Vane's gaze slid to her, unimpressed, unmoved. I'll talk about whatever costs me money, miss. And you 4 have cost me a great deal of it. Garrett dismounted slowly, deliberately, placing himself between Vane's riders and the women behind him. 18 years, he said. You've had 18 years to forget my name. Seems you didn't manage it. Something flickered across Vane's composed face. Recognition, cold and sudden. Cole, he said, testing the name like an old debt he'd forgotten was owed. The rancher with the fire. The rancher whose wife and daughter you murdered, Garrett said, and his voice had dropped into something low and terrible, for water rights on land you never even ended up using. An unfortunate accident, Vane said, though the smoothness had thinned just slightly, a crack showing under decades of careful denial. Lanterns are dangerous things, Mr. Cole. Barns catch fire, without any help, from men like me. 2 sets of boot prints, Garrett said. Neither of them mine. I've carried that knowledge 18 years, waiting for the day I'd get to say it to your face instead of to an empty grave. The yard had gone deathly still. Even Vane's riders shifted uneasily now, the weight of the accusation settling heavy over all of them. "This is a fascinating conversation," Vane said, recovering his composure, with practiced ease, "but it changes nothing about tonight. I've come for the land. The girl's father refused to sell water rights that, by rights of inheritance now due to his daughters, belong on paper to them. I intend to correct that oversight tonight, one way or another." "There's no oversight to correct," Maggie said, voice shaking but clear. "We have Hargrove's sworn testimony. We have a judge's ruling, from this very afternoon. Everything you've built is already unraveling in a courthouse 3 days from here." "Testimony from a coward," Vane said, dismissive. "Rulings can be appealed. Land, once taken, is considerably harder to give back." "You won't take it," Garrett said. Vane smiled, thin and cold. "I count 12 riders to your what? 1 wounded rancher and 4 women." "5, said a new voice, riding up hard, from the tree line. Sheriff Callum Boone reined in beside Garrett, rifle already in hand, 3 deputies fanning out behind him, and the sudden shift in numbers rippled visibly through Vane's men. "Sheriff," Vane said, and for the first time something like uncertainty crossed his features. "This is a civil land matter. Outside your jurisdiction." "Wrong on 2 counts, Boone said, calm as still water. "First, attempted arson on private property, and armed trespass, with intent to seize land by force is very much my jurisdiction. Second," he pulled a folded document from his coat, holding it up plain for everyone in that yard to see, "I've been building a case against you for the better part of a year, Vane." Quietly. "Because a sheriff, who moves too loud against a man with your money tends to end up conveniently dead, before the paperwork's finished." Vane's jaw tightened. "I have testimony," Boone continued, "from 3 different landowners you've squeezed dry these past 2 decades. I have banking records showing payments to a man named Whitfield, who's currently sitting in my jail cell in Silverbend, having ridden straight into my deputy's arms 2 days after fleeing this ranch, eager to trade information for a lighter sentence." Boone's eyes hardened. "And as of this afternoon, I have a signed courtroom confession from Jacob Hargrove naming you directly in his brother's death." The yard held its breath. "You've been building quite a case," Vane said, voice tight now, the smoothness cracking further with every word Boone laid down. 18 years is a long time to wait for justice, Vane," Boone said. "But it's not too long. Not for the family you burned. And not for the one you've been trying to burn all over again." Vane's eyes moved across the yard. "The sisters." Garrett, bleeding still faintly beneath his shirt, where the old wound hadn't fully closed. Boone and his deputies, rifles level and steady. His own riders, exchanging uneasy glances now, men hired for money, not loyalty, weighing the cost of a fight against a lawman, with paperwork already filed. "Stand down," Vane said finally, quiet, bitter. "All of you. Stand down." His riders lowered their weapons, some visibly relieved to do so. Vane's gaze found Garrett one last time. "This isn't finished, Cole." "No," Garrett agreed. "It isn't. But it's finished the way you wanted it finished. From here on, it's finished the way I want it to be." Boone's deputies moved forward, and Cornelius Vane, a man who had ruled this territory, through fear and fire for 2 decades, was placed under arrest in the same dirt yard, where he'd once sat astride his horse counting the cost of everything he intended to take. He did not go quietly. But he went. That night, after the riders had scattered, and Boone's men had led Vane away in irons, the 5 of them sat together on the porch steps, too wrung out for words, watching smoke still curling faint, from the east pasture, where the fire had finally burned itself down to embers. Charlotte was the first to speak, her voice small in the dark. "Is it really over?" "The worst of it," Garrett said. "Trials take time. Vane's got money enough to drag his out for months. He looked out at the scarred fence line, barely visible now against the stars. But the fear's different now. It's got a name attached to it. A cell. That's not nothing. 18 years, Maggie said quietly, and it only took one frightened man cracking open in a courtroom to bring the whole thing down. It took more than that, Eleanor said, and reached over, without quite thinking about it, to take Garrett's hand, careful of the bandage still wrapped tight around his forearm. It took someone willing to stand in front of 12 armed riders, and not move. Garrett didn't answer that. Just let his hand stay where it was, rough fingers curling loose around hers, and for a long, while none of them said anything more, content simply to sit together in the dark, alive, and finally, improbably, safe. The weeks that followed passed strange and slow, the particular quiet that settles after a long storm finally breaks. Vane's trial would take months to fully resolve, tangled as it was in decades of buried crimes across 3 counties, but the essential truth of it was no longer in question. Testimony piled upon testimony. Whitfield, eager to save his own skin, corroborated everything Hargrove had confessed, and considerably more besides. The water rights, the land, the fire, 18 years passed, all of it, finally, dragged into daylight, where it could no longer hide. Garrett rode into Larkspur one final time near the trial's end, not because he was required to testify further, but because he needed, after 18 years, to sit in a room and watch the man who'd taken everything from him finally answer for it in front of witnesses instead of shadows. He came home quieter than he'd left. Eleanor found him, that evening at the small fenced plot behind the house, where he'd finally, after all these years, placed a proper marker for the wife and daughter he'd carried in a wooden box for 2 decades rather than lay to rest. "You did it," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "I didn't bring them back," Garrett said. "Nothing I did in that courtroom brings them back." "No," Eleanor agreed. "But you stopped carrying it alone." Garrett looked at her, and something in his face had changed these past weeks, some old weight finally set down, where it could stop crushing everything beneath it. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, quiet, raw in a way she'd never heard from him before. 20 years of nothing but grief and work. "I don't rightly know how a man starts over." "You already have," Eleanor said. "The day you paid $500 for 4 strangers nobody else wanted." "That wasn't starting over," Garrett said. "That was just refusing to watch cruelty happen in front of me." "Maybe," Eleanor said. "Or maybe some part of you already knew, even then, that we weren't strangers you were buying. We were the family you'd been waiting for, without knowing it, for 18 years. Garrett's throat worked. For a long moment he said nothing at all. "I love you," he said finally. Plain. Unadorned. The kind of confession that costs a careful man everything to make. "I didn't plan on it. Didn't think I had it left in me to feel this again. But I do. I love you, Eleanor Ashford, and I've been too much of a coward to say it, until right now, standing in front of the only 2 graves I've got left to answer to." Eleanor's eyes filled, and for the first time, since that terrible day on the auction platform, the tears that came weren't born of fear. "I love you too," she said. "Have, I think, since the day you asked if I needed help climbing down, and actually waited for my answer." Garrett pulled her close, careful of his healing arm, and for a long moment they simply stood there together in the fading light, 2 people who'd both been taught by hard years that safety was a lie told to children, finally allowing themselves to believe otherwise. Behind them, unnoticed, the 2 small graves caught the last of the sun, no longer a wound Garrett carried alone in silence, but a quiet corner of a home that had finally, after 18 years, learned how to hold both grief and joy in the same open hand. The seasons turned kinder after that. Maggie took over the full running of the ranch ledgers, expanded now to include the modest inheritance rightfully passed down from their father's estate once the water rights were legally restored to the Ashford name, and opened the old schoolhouse to children, from neighboring ranches, teaching Greek and Latin, and mathematics to students, whose families had once looked at her the same way Silverbend had looked at all four sisters. Charlotte's infirmary grew a proper reputation across 2 counties, her steady hands, and steadier voice drawing ranchers half a day's ride just for her care, and she built a life around healing, that never once felt incomplete for lacking a husband to complete it. Adeline's paintings found their way, eventually, into a gallery in the territorial capital, small canvases of mountains, and horses and a ranch house, that looked, in her careful brushstrokes, exactly like what it had become. A home. Chosen, not inherited. And Eleanor married Garrett Cole the following spring, in the yard, where a burned fence line had once marked the edge of a war neither of them asked for, now grown thick again, with new grass, and the particular resilience of land, that had finally been given the chance to heal. There was no grand church for it, no crowd of strangers passing judgment, from the rails the way they once had at an auction platform in Silverbend. Just family. Maggie stood beside Eleanor, with a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself, from the east pasture, the same pasture, that had once burned. Charlotte cried through the whole ceremony, unashamed, and Adeline captured the day afterward in paint, the 2 of them standing beneath the cottonwood, Garrett so much taller than his bride, that the preacher had joked he'd need to raise his voice just to be heard clear up to the groom. "You look terrified," Eleanor whispered to him, right before the vows, low enough that only he could hear it. "I am," Garrett admitted. "Man waits 18 years to feel something like this again. Gets a little out of practice." "Good," Eleanor said, something fierce and fond moving behind her eyes. "Means it still matters." "It matters," Garrett said. "More than I know how to say out loud." "Then don't say it," Eleanor said. "Just stay." "That," Garrett said, taking her hands in his, "I can do. Because that's the thing about survival, when you've clawed your way, through the worst of it. It doesn't just end the story. It becomes the foundation everything else gets built on top of." For sisters, once priced and mocked, and nearly sold, into separate kinds of ruin, found instead a home nobody could have promised them on that auction platform. A mountain man who'd spent 20 years believing love only ever led to loss found, against every hard lesson 18 years of grief had taught him, that some griefs can finally be set down once justice arrives to carry their weight instead. And a valley in the Bitterroot Mountains, once nearly consumed by one man's greed for water, and land and the suffering of people he never once bothered to see, as human, stood instead as proof of something far more enduring. That family isn't always the blood you're born into. Sometimes it's the family you choose. The family that chooses you back. Built, piece by careful piece, from the broken parts nobody else thought were worth saving at all.